All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the North Carolina Botanical Garden. My name is David Michaud. I am our program and engagement coordinator, and we have such a fantastic crowd here in the room with us. I know we had some parking issues for some of you, so we thank you for fighting those and coming in here with a smile regardless. And those of you on Zoom, we've got a fantastic audience online. We thank you all for joining us today as well. Um, I'd like to also introduce Emily Oglesby in the back of the room. She is standing in, learning the ropes about these hybrid programs. She's our communications and exhibits coordinator here at the Garden. Makes a lot of great things happen on our social media, has helped promote this talk, and I imagine that's why a lot of you are here in the room with us. Without any further ado, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Clyde Sorenson is an Alumni Association Distinguished Undergraduate Professor of Entomology at North Carolina State University. He teaches several courses at NCSU, including his undergrad Insects and People and the and the graduate course Insect Ecology. Dr. Sorenson has conducted research on the ecology and management of agricultural pests, and more recently on the ecology of insects associated with North Carolina forest systems, especially those found in the longleaf systems. He lives in Clayton with his wife Leanne, 2 chocolate labs, 3 cats, and a 42 or 43, he's not quite sure year old, blue-fronted Amazon parrot named Floyd. So, Clyde, we thank you so much for being here today, and welcome again to all of you. I will turn it over to you to learn.
Sorenson.
Apologies.
No. That's a Stanley County pronunciation. All right. I appreciate y'all coming out, and hopefully I'll kind of inspire you to pay some more attention to these really cool animals we're going to talk about. There we go. All right, so let's start by talking about what bioluminescence is. So bioluminescence, as most everybody here probably already knows, is light production by a living organism. All right, and there's lots and lots of organisms that do produce light. It's a really cool process because it's actually a really cool process. I'll get more of that in just a minute. So the chemicals that are typically involved in the production of light in living critters are first luciferins. All right, so luciferins, that's a family of chemicals. Different luciferins can produce different kinds of light, different colors of light. And in order for luciferins to produce light, you also need oxygen in the system. You need an enzyme called luciferase, which is also a large family of different chemicals. And then you need the energy source that all cells run on, which is ATP. And we think, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, we think in fireflies, the primary way they regulate light production is by regulating oxygen into the system. And they can recycle the luciferin, they can recycle luciferase. So lots and lots of different things do produce light. We're going to be talking a lot about insects today, but there are bioluminescent fish, there are bioluminescent snails, bioluminescent centipedes, not in this part of the world, bioluminescent fungi like jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, dinoflagellates. How many of y'all have ever been down to the beach on a really dark night and kick the sand, right? Tick off the dinoflagellates, right? Really cool. Bacteria, lots and lots of other organisms. And some organisms exploit light, but they don't actually produce it themselves. They co-opt other organisms and use their ability to make light. So there are some fish that have little pockets in their skin where they sequester bioluminescent microorganisms. And there's at least one cockroach that does that. Unfortunately, it doesn't live here. It would be really cool if it did. Of course, the most kind of familiar and famous bioluminescent organisms are fireflies. How many of y'all call them fireflies? How many of y'all call them lightning bugs? I called them lightning bugs till I got an education. Now I call them fireflies. I don't know why that is, but that's what happened. So what is a firefly? So first things first, fireflies aren't flies, and lightning bugs aren't bugs, all right? They're actually beetles, all right? And they belong to the family Lampyridae. And Lampyridae, not coincidentally, somebody actually thought this thing out, means light bearer. Now, the Lampyrids, the fireflies, are pretty closely related to some other kinds of beetles you might be familiar with, including click beetles and cerambicids and a couple other kind of weird things we're going to talk about a bit later. So to the ancient Greeks, they were the Chysolampus, that basically translates into the one with the glowing butt. They're closely related to another group of beetles that we'll talk shortly about, and that's the Fangodids. Anybody ever encountered a Fangodid? Yeah, I know y'all did because I was there. But anyway, we'll talk more about them in a minute. And then in addition to the Lampyrids and the Fangodids, there are a couple other insects in North Carolina that produce light that we'll try and address. So if we want to look at the diversity of fireflies in North Carolina compared to in the world, well, in the world, there are somewhere in the neighborhood of between 1,700 and 2,000 identified species, and there's probably maybe that many more that haven't been sorted out yet. This is, by the way, this is true across the diversity of insects. So how many species of insects have been identified? Anybody know that number? It's more than anything else on the face of the planet. All right, so 1 million, roughly, species of insects, and there are probably between 2 and 5 million species that haven't been identified yet. And so this is kind of a pattern across the diversity of insects. In the U.S., we have about 170 species in about 20 different genera, and in North Carolina, we have somewhere between 30 and 40 species in about 8 different genera. All right, and that's actually pretty good diversity. In North Carolina, some of the conspicuous genera we'll talk a little bit more about in detail in a moment would include Photinus. So this is Photinus pyralis. This is probably the most familiar firefly in North Carolina. We call it the Big Dipper. I'll show you some more about him a little bit later. In addition to Photinus, we have Photurus, and you keep seeing PHO on it. That's light. That's referring in one way or another to light. So Photurus are also quite common and conspicuous in North Carolina, and these are probably the biggest fireflies that we have in the state. They have some really weird things that they do we'll talk about shortly. Pyracmina, this is Pyracmina. Pyracmina includes probably the earliest flying species in the year, species called Pyracmina borealis, so the firefly from the north. And then the last one that I'm going to talk at some length about is Phausis. So Phausis are the ghost fireflies, and they're really, really cool, and we've been doing some really cool things with them shortly. I will describe what that is in a minute. All right, so this is the list of our fireflies in North Carolina that we know of. That's just the ones that we know of. And you'll notice one of them's got a question mark on it because we think it's a new species. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But we almost certainly have at least 10 or 15 other species that occur someplace in North Carolina. We just haven't figured it out yet. And some of those may be undescribed, or they may be species that we know of from other areas that just haven't been identified yet in North Carolina. Now, I want you to notice that some of those names are in blue. Roughly, maybe a quarter of them to a third of them are in blue. And so remember that, because that gets to our next point, and that is that not all fireflies are lightning bugs. A fairly substantial fraction of the species don't have lights. They're day flying, and we think most of them use pheromones to communicate instead of light. And the interesting thing is we think that almost all of those day-flying, what we call dark fireflies, actually evolved from lit fireflies, that they abandoned nocturnal uh, lifestyles because they were trying to avoid, we think, bat predation. So it's the evolutionary history of fireflies is wacky. And so sometimes things go in one direction and then the tide goes back in the other direction. So there are a couple species where the females glow or have light organs and the males don't. And they're night active and they're still using light for communication, but for whatever reason, the males no longer exploit light for whatever reason they might have exploited it for beforehand. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So this is one of the common dark fireflies. I have these in my yard. In fact, I took that picture in my backyard. That's Lucidota atra. I've gone up to Stone Mountain about this time of year, and sometimes on the trails at Stone Mountain, there are just hundreds of them flying all over the place. So the really conspicuous and pretty insect. This is another one of the day flyers. This is called the winter firefly. This is one that actually you can find in January and February on warm days. And they'll usually be sitting on trees. And yet another dark firefly is this little teeny guy right here, Pyropyga minuta. This thing is about that long, but it looks like a good firefly. And again, I took that picture in my backyard as well. So another important thing to know is that not all fireflies are fireflies. So there are lots of critters that mimic fireflies. And they do that for a really important reason, and that is that some fireflies produce really noxious chemicals to protect themselves from predators. And so we see lots of, are y'all familiar with the distinction between Mullerian and Batesian mimicry? Are those terms familiar? So in Batesian mimicry, you've got a toxic model and non-toxic mimics, right? In Mullerian mimicry, you have a toxic model, and then the other one's toxic too. They just kind of reinforce the signal. But there are lots of Batesian mimics of fireflies. So that's a click beetle that mimics fireflies, and that's a soldier beetle that mimics fireflies, and that's a longhorn beetle, a cerambycid, that mimics fireflies. And there's a ground beetle that mimics fireflies. And for crying out loud, there's a moth that mimics fireflies. So lots of insects try and exploit the fact that some fireflies are very well defended chemically. All right, so most fireflies are vigorous predators as larvae, and they spend most of their lifespan as larvae. They're really remarkable little critters. So you might have a firefly larva that's about less than an inch long, and it can bite a slug that's 2.5 inches long and immobilize it, and then spend 2 weeks eating it. So they're really, really vigorous predators on other invertebrates. They inhabit a tremendous diversity of habitats. Most fireflies, though, have very specific habitat requirements per species. And so there are only a couple fireflies that actually kind of are habitat generalists, and we'll talk about one of them a little bit later. In some of them, the females are wingless and larviform. We'll see an example of that a little bit later. This is an important thing to consider, because if you've got a species where the females are wingless, larviform animals, they don't have a tremendous amount of dispersal ability, right? They can disperse about as far as a little worm-like critter can crawl in her 2 or 3 or 4 week long adult life. And the vast majority of species, with a couple exceptions, don't feed as adults. So the adult stage in most fireflies, the whole reason it's there is to disperse and to make sure that there are new fireflies next year. And so they pretty much devote their entire adult lifespan to those missions. That's what one of the larvae looks like. Isn't that a cool critter? Like a little miniature alligator with little venomous mandibles. So its mandibles are hollow and they've got venom glands associated with them. They find a prey item, they basically stab it and envenomate it, and then they spend whatever amount of time it takes to consume that thing, primarily by liquefying tissue and sucking it in. So anyway, really cool. All right, so what about the lights? What's up with the lights? So where did it come from? We think the ability to produce light in fireflies first evolved in the larvae as what we call an aposematic signal. Anybody familiar with that term? Aposematism, that's basically warning. Monarchs are orange and black as a warning to predators that if you eat me, you're going to get sick. And we think that light originally evolved in these creatures for the same purpose, to warn predators that if you eat me, you're going to get sick. And then that happened about 141 million years ago, which is a fairly long time ago. And then about 10 million years after that evolutionary step, we think that adults started co-opting this ability to produce light. And they co-opted it primarily, not for aposematism, but for sexual signaling. And bear in mind that when all this was happening, there were no birds flying around in the air. There weren't any bats flying around in the air. What was flying in the air at this point in time was insects and maybe some pterosaurs, but not a whole lot else. So the lights are, again, primarily used in most species for sexual communication. That's how they find their mates. Different genera oftentimes have different colored lights. So the Pyracmina I mentioned earlier, the Pyracmina borealis, its light's actually kind of amber colored, whereas the Phytinus pyralis, the big dippers that are so common right now, have more of a yellowish or greenish light. The Photurus often has a very green light, and we'll talk about ghost fireflies a little bit later because it's a little bit more complicated. So within each species, they have their own signaling system. And most fireflies use systems of flashing of their lights to communicate with each other. There's a couple that don't. We'll talk about them too. And what typically happens, at least in this part of the world, is that the males do the risky business of flying around and advertising themselves conspicuously. All right? And the females typically sit either on the ground or in vegetation. Depending on the species, the females could be at the top of trees, but they're sitting still, watching for the males. And when a male makes his species signal and he does it just right, and a female sees it, she'll signal back to him with that species specific female signal. If he's lucky enough to see that, he'll respond again, and she'll respond, and they'll keep responding until he gets close enough to land near her, and then he'll run over and they'll shake hands and whatever has to transpire, and then nobody makes any light for a while. All right. If they find each other acceptable, and by the way, the males almost always find the females acceptable. Sometimes the females don't find the males acceptable. Sounds familiar. Anyway, they'll go ahead and copulate. And in some species, that copulation can take a very, very long time. And I'll talk about why that is in a minute. All right, so this is just a real short video that demonstrates one of the signaling systems. You're going to have to look very carefully at this cheesy video that I shot in my backyard. but this is Phytinus pyralis. This is the one that we call the Big Dipper, the one that almost everybody's got flying around in the yards right now at dusk. And you'll kind of watch in the middle. Fortunately for us, this one's actually going to fly to the screen. I have to watch carefully. About every 4 seconds, though, there he is. Every 4 seconds, he makes a J-shaped flash, okay? About every 4 seconds, he does this. And he's doing this, by the way, at a specific time of day. This is a species that starts calling, starts advertising at dusk, so before it gets dark. And he's doing it in a very specific kind of habitat, which is usually an open area. And he's flying about this far off the ground. Different species have different behaviors in all those respects. While he's flying around now, females are sitting in this species on low vegetation along the edge of the lawn or down in the grass. And if they see a male doing what they want him to do, doing it just right, 2 seconds after he makes his flash, she flashes for a half second. And if he sees that, 2 seconds later, he flashes again, she responds, and so on and so forth, all right? Each species has its own signaling system of that sort, but the signals can be very, very different. So right now in my yard, I've got 2 other species of Phytinus that are displaying. One of them flashes twice at about 1 second interval, and then it's dark for 5 seconds, and then it flashes twice again. And just last night, I got a new species in my yard, which flashes once every 4 or 5 seconds. Little bitty guy called marginalis. So that's how it works most of the time. There are some issues, though. Some species have different kinds of lags, and that lag can vary with the temperature. The cooler it is, usually the longer the lags. Some of them, especially the Phyturus, have multiple flash patterns, which gets really annoying if you're trying to figure out who lives in your yard, especially if it's a species that lives 60 feet up in the tops of the trees and you don't have shotgun shell with pellets small enough to shoot it down. And then some use their lights maybe for some, maybe we'll just say more nefarious purposes, which we'll talk about directly. All right, so they're out there flying around advertising themselves, right? They're very conspicuous. How many of y'all caught fireflies as kids? How many of y'all still catch fireflies? Okay. All right. So they're very conspicuous, and we see them, certainly other predators see them, but a lot of them are, again, protected by chemicals. And the chemicals that are most prominent in this part of the world are chemicals called lucibufigins. Does that name have any familiarity to anybody? Part of it anyway? Well, luciv means light, so lighted bufigins. So what's bufo? Anybody?
Toads.
It used to be toad, right? They changed the genus on us to keep doing that silly stuff, but used to be bufo was the genus for toads, most of the toad species in North America. And of course, toads are kind of notorious for producing toxins, right? Bufigins, which are really interesting and complicated toxins. These are chemically related to those toxins that toads produce, but they're not like licking toads to get them. They make them themselves, all right? They're just chemically similar to those particular toxins. And if anybody, has anybody ever tasted a firefly? Yeah. I convinced one of my grad students a couple years ago to put one in his mouth, and he reported it as being really bitter, and then his mouth was numb for about 20 minutes too. So they're effective. They're very, very bitter, and they do have a fair amount of toxicity associated with if you ingest enough of them. So really, really distasteful. Other fireflies produce other kinds of toxins, but some fireflies don't produce any. And that's important to us, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, how many of y'all have ever noticed that fireflies have a distinct smell? Right? So here's something that still baffles me and something I'm trying to convince one of my colleagues to work on. As charismatic as these things are, as familiar as they are, as much as people have caught them for the heck of it over the last thousands of years, nobody's actually investigated the smell, but it's probably an aposematic signal as well. And so I'm trying to convince one of my colleagues to see if we can't sort out exactly what those chemicals are. And they may be related to the lucibufficans, maybe a degradation product or an intermediate product in the synthesis that they use as an additional warning. So lots of fireflies exploit these chemicals that they produce by also reflexively bleeding. Y'all familiar with that behavior? There are other animals that do that. So how many of you have like 10,000 little Asian multicolored ladybirds running around in the house right now? If you know, if you aggravate them, they leave orange marks all over. That's reflexive bleeding. They're bleeding on your walls just to get even with you. And so this is a Phytinus carolinus. This is the mountain synchronous firefly. And that white goop right there is hemolymph, this toxin that she's leaked out, or he's leaked out. That's probably a he, has leaked out to kind of reinforce that it's not necessarily a good idea to eat me. Now, they do some other stuff with those lucibufficans. One important thing that they do, those that make lucibufficans, is that they use them as a nuptial gift. And what's that? That's basically when they mate, the male provisions the female with a large packet of protein and toxins. And then she can use the protein to help synthesize more eggs. Then she can use the toxins to help protect those eggs from predators. And so consequently, this is huge. That's one of the nuptial gifts that's been extracted. My colleague Sarah Lewis up at Tufts did this work. And that constitutes like 5 to 10% of the weight of the male. It's a huge investment that he's giving to her. But apparently,
done?
Pardon?
How is it done?
So when they're copulating, pumping it in. So consequently, some of these species copulate for 12 hours. Yeah. And the bigger the nuptial gift, the more likely that male sperm is to be used to fertilize her eggs, and the more eggs she's liable to produce. So many fireflies, those that produce these toxins, can do this. But again, some fireflies don't produce toxins. All right, so we'll just go through a couple examples of some species from these different genera real quickly. And the first one we'll go with is the mountain synchronous firefly, Phytinus carolinus. That's the Carolina firefly. Isn't that cool? And this one is the one that's famous for the synchronous displays at Elkmont and now at Grandfather Mountain and many other places in the mountains. So this species has a range that's roughly described by that polygon there. In North Carolina, we typically don't see it below about 2,000 feet in elevation, but it goes all the way up to, at Grandfather, all the way up to over 5,000 feet in elevation. This is the kind of habitat this species likes. Again, each species tends to be a habitat specialist, and this is a critter that likes mature hardwood forests, usually near a stream where it stays moist pretty much year-round. So the basic life cycle, we can start off during the courtship phase, which at Elkmont is going to be in about a week and a half. At Grandfather, it's going to be at about a month because of the elevation difference. And so in this species, the males, when they're calling, fly about 3 to 4 feet above the surface of the leaf litter, and they have a signaling system that's composed of 4 to 8 flashes, followed by about 8 seconds of dark. And so 6 to 8 seconds. So Males are flying around, they're flashing, they go dark. In this species, if they're at high densities, everybody goes dark at the same time and everybody flashes at the same time. That's the magic of it when you go up to see them in the mountains. On any given night, only a small fraction of the females are actually interested, all right? Some of them are too young to mate, they just emerged too soon. Some of them already mated. So on any given night, males way outnumber the females. The females are sitting on the forest floor, and their response to the males is two really faint little flashes, about 3 seconds, about halfway through that dark interval. And then in this species, the females may mate multiple times. Again, the copulation takes forever because of that huge nuptial gift that they're sharing. And then once she gets done with all this, she'll produce one batch of eggs, usually around 40 eggs in the batch, and then she dies. And that's it. Adult fireflies in this species only live about 2 to 3 weeks. And they basically run on whatever energy they were able to sock away as larvae. Those eggs hatch in about 3 weeks. The larvae are predaceous, live just under the soil surface or under the leaf litter. I think they go through 3 larval molts rather, stages, and then once they get done with their larval development, and by the way, they spend the winter as larvae, and I should have mentioned this earlier, the eggs glow, the larvae glow, the pupae glow. And that's true across very many different species. They spend the winter as a larva. In the spring, they pupate in a little cell they excavate in the soil. And then after about 3 weeks, they emerge, they do all that fun courtship business, and then they die in about 2.5, maybe 3 weeks. The adults in this species, like the adults of most fireflies, don't feed. All right, so another example we can talk about is Photurus. So Photurus fireflies fall into 2 groups. And one of the groups that we see in Photurus, some of us call them big scaries. And why would we do that? So because in these species that we call the big scaries, the females are predaceous. They're large. You can, by the way, you can usually identify a Photurus by, it's going to be a pretty bulky firefly. It's got long legs, and if you look at them from the side, they're hunchbacked, which is kind of distinctive. Now, in Photurus, the females, when they're unmated, behave themselves. In these species, if they're virgins, on the right night, at the right time of night, in the right habitat, they watch for male Photurus fireflies. They see a male Photurus, they give a female Photurus signal, and the same thing happens. They get together, they shake hands, and then they mate. On subsequent nights, those same Photurus females stop watching for male Photurus and start watching for male Photinus. All right? And if they see a male Photinus, they mimic the signal of the female Photinus. All right? And so this hapless little male Photinus is flying around looking for love. He sees a signal. He goes, "My lucky night." And he flies down, keeps signaling. She keeps mimicking. And then he lands on her leaf and he runs over to shake hands, and she eats him. And she does that because Photurus fireflies don't produce lucibufficants. And so she's eating those males primarily to acquire the toxins the lucibufigans that male has that he was going to give to his beloved as a nuptial gift, right? And so she steals them basically. All right.
Did anybody figure that?
There's a lot of weird folks like me around. The fellow named Thomas Eisner, you may have heard of him before. He was instrumental in sorting some of this out. And his whole career was built around figuring out the weird ways insects protect themselves. He was a really remarkable scientist. These guys will actually snag them in midair if they can't get one to respond. They'll just fly down and snatch them out of midair, or they'll steal them from spider webs. So they're very, very intent on getting those lucibufigans, and then they use those chemicals to protect their eggs from predators once they've laid them. Now, Photurus is really aggravating because this is the genus that has many species that have multiple flash signals in them. So you'll see one species with 2 or 3 different flash patterns. They're also aggravating because a lot of them spend their entire lives, except the larval stage, 60 feet off the ground. And so I've got Photurus in my yard. I can see the flash patterns, and I go to identify them by flash pattern. Well, lo and behold, it's one that's got 3 different flash patterns. And I can't ever acquire them because they're 60 feet above ground, and nobody wants me shooting a shotgun in the dark. So they're really cool insects, though. And I should mention one of the other species here, Photurus frontalis, is another synchronous firefly. This is the one, has anybody heard of the synchronous fireflies at Congaree National Park in South Carolina? Yeah, this is the species that occurs there. And in this species, it's really cool because if the males can see each other, they flash about once every half second. And if they can see each other, they flash in perfect unison. So I have this species in my backyard. You may have it in your backyard. But I only get 30 or 40 of them. But it's still pretty cool to see 30 or 40 fireflies all flashing in perfect unison. At Congaree, there's thousands of them. And so you get this perfect unison flashing, but it kind of looks like a wave and it almost strobes across the landscape as these local guys flash in unison, and these guys are seeing them just a little bit later. It's really, really cool. And that, by the way, is also one that's not a predaceous species in the adult female. So here are a couple of our Photurus species. I have at least 2 of these in my yard. You probably have them in your yard as well. And again, you can see the long legs, the kind of robust size. A lot of them have these stripes on their wings as well, and that kind of hunched posture. And that's a larval Photurus. Again, really, really aggressive little predator in the leaf litter. All right, so real quickly, the last firefly group I'm going to talk about in any detail is the Phausis fireflies. These are the ghost fireflies. We have at least 10 species in North America. There's probably double that, a bunch that we haven't identified yet. And these are tiny fireflies. These guys are only maybe a little more than 1/8 of an inch long. Little bitty rascals. And in this group, the females are all wingless and larviform. They're about the size of a grain of rice, right? And pretty much the color of a grain of rice, with little light organs on in their abdomen. And in about, I think, of the known 10 species, 7 of those species, the males are dark. The females have light organs, the males don't. But a couple of the species, the males do. And probably the most familiar of these is the blue ghost. Has anybody seen blue ghost fireflies? All right, up in the mountains.
Well, I think so. This was in Middle Tennessee.
That was quite, certainly could be the same, or maybe a very closely related species. It gets weird with these guys. So ghost fireflies are kind of exceptional because they don't flash. The males fly around a couple feet off the ground with their light lit for maybe 25, 30 seconds at a time. Sometimes the Faustus reticulata, the mountain blue ghost, they'll keep their light on for a full minute. And so they're flying about 2 feet off the ground with their light lit, looking for a little tiny green dot on the ground, which is the female. So this is a picture that one of my students took just this past weekend up near Brevard. And that's what you would see. That's why they call them blue ghosts. Here's the thing, though. They're not actually blue. They're green. That's the actual true color. But because of an optical illusion called the Purkinje effect, when you see a faint green light at any distance, your eyes shift it towards blue. So if you're holding one of these things in your hand, it's green. But when you see it at more than about 5 or 6 feet away, it looks blue. And that's where the name blue ghost came from. Yes, sir.
What is it about their seasonality if they're all out in Brevard, in my case, Hendersonville?
So, oh gosh.
This week.
So this is the reticulata at about 2,000 feet. This is when they're going to be flying. I think this past weekend may have been close to the peak.
Yeah, 3,300 feet is where I got them.
Yeah, and so if you go in those same areas in late June, early July, there will be another emergence of ghost fireflies. We've always thought that they were these guys on a different schedule, but there's some evidence that it's actually yet another species of ghost firefly. So I'm going to get into this, and these guys over here are going to be tired of hearing about it because I've been talking to them for 5 years about it. But anyway, we have a ghost firefly right around here. How many of y'all have seen it? All right. We have a ghost firefly right around here that science doesn't know yet. And we didn't really know anything about until about 6 years ago. All right, 5 years ago. We'll talk more about that in a second. So the life cycle for these guys, the females live in a little burrow at the soil surface. When they're ready to mate, they come up and basically stick their butt in the air and wait until a male comes by. They're flying, like I said earlier. The females in this group, we don't know if they mate multiple times or if they only mate one time. But when they get done mating, they lay one batch of eggs with about 30 eggs in it. They curl their little rice grain sized bodies up around their little egg mass, and they guard it until they die. And then those eggs hatch some weeks later. And then again, we think they have a year-long life cycle. We're not certain of that. And again, in our mountains in North Carolina, reticulata, the one that's very familiar, typically has its primary flight period in the middle to the latter half of May. So you're a little bit out of sync with the synchronous fireflies. The blue ghosts peak about 2 weeks before the synchronous fireflies peak. And then we get this other little peak a little bit later in the year. So to get to the situation we have here, we have in this part of the state another ghost firefly. And the story of how we're quote unquote discovering it is kind of convoluted. I probably don't have enough time to tell you, but suffice to say is we didn't know anything about them 5 years ago to speak of. And in the interim, we've been trying to figure out more about them. So some colleagues of mine and I, a couple years ago, started this Carolina Ghost Hunt Citizen Science Project. It's Jerry Reynolds and Chris Goforth at the Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh. You're welcome to participate, but we think it's over for the year. But next year, they're going to be back around. And so just to give you an idea of what we're looking at, this is reticulata. This is the mountain blue ghost here. And this is one of our, what we're calling Piedmont ghosts now. And if you'll look at them, you can see there are some differences. The antennae are different colors, right? If you see this shield that protects the head is called the pronotum. And if you look at that, it's shaped somewhat differently. Back up. It's shaped somewhat differently. And also the coloring, the maculation on it's different. If you look at them from the underside, there are some prominent differences as well. Our Piedmont ghosts tend to have very much smaller light organs. And this structure at the back end is called the pygidium, all right, the tail. And if you look here on the reticulata, it's kind of got a shallow notch in it. You see, back up. I don't know if I can make this pointer work over there, but anyway. And then if you look at that same structure on our Piedmont ghosts, the notch is much more acute. So there's some morphological differences. We don't know whether that means anything or not yet. So our next step, and a step that Deb and Keith helped us out with a great deal just a couple of weeks ago, is we've collected material. We're going to do some genetic analysis and see just exactly how far from reticulata it is genetically, but it's almost certainly a new species. So this is what the female looks like. All right, pretty spectacular animal, right? Yeah, remember, it's about the size of a grain of rice. That's another difference between the mountain ghosts and our ghosts. The mountain ghosts tend to have between 6 and 12 light spots in their abdomen, and our little gals only ever have 2, as far as we've been able to determine so far. So we think we got a new species. This is what reticulata likes in the mountains. Again, mature hardwood forests near a creek. And our guy tends to like mixed pine and oak forests, hardwood forests. And it seems to be more tolerant of drier habitat, which would make sense. So there's maybe some behavioral differences as well. So there's our ghost hunt. If you want to participate, it's easy to find. All you got to do next April is just Google Carolina Ghost Hunt, and it'll take you right to it. You can help us out. But we're really interested in learning more about where they are. So we know that we have good concentration of them right in this general area. We have at least one record from over near the PD River in Montgomery County. But we still are learning about it. This is a species that's new to science. And so there's everything to learn about it. All right, so real quickly, some other glowing insects. We can talk about real quickly the fangodids. So fangodids are beetles. That's an adult female fangodid. Does it look like a beetle? Not very much, right? A lot of folks call them railroad worms, and that's because they have light organs all along the sides of their body. I took that picture in my bathroom at 2 o'clock in the morning, and what that is a flash exposure combined with a time exposure. So I shot a 3-second, 4-second exposure with a flash on top of it, and so you can see where the lights are. That's what it looks like in the dark. And they keep their lights on. Now, this is an animal that's about this long, but they're big. And so when you see one of these creeping through the forest, it looks like a little slow-moving subway car. And I think that's where railroad worm comes from. These things are primarily feed on millipedes. And one of the best ways to try and find them during the daytime is look for dead millipedes, because oftentimes there'll be one of these curled up in that empty millipede husk. The larvae are also bioluminescent, and they also feed on millipedes. Now, that's what the male looks like. And for years, I was puzzled by how in the world did that thing and that thing mate? It doesn't look like it should be physically possible. But last spring, we actually found a pair in my backyard coupled up. And yep, they do it. There's still fangodids around. All right. Another glowing insect we're not going to talk much about is the glowworms that we find in New Zealand and Australia. Anybody ever heard of these?
Well, they're in something like this is in Alabama. Isn't this the,
Just wait.
okay.
It's not just Alabama. So these are larvae of a fly, and they basically live on the ceilings of caves and grottos. They drop lots of these sticky mucilaginous lines down from their little silk and spit hammocks, and then they turn their little blue lights on to attract insects up into their death trap. So they use their light purely to help them acquire prey. As it turns out, we have our own version here in North Carolina. And this is what you're talking about in Alabama. And some folks call them foxfire worms. This is Orphelia fultoni. This is the larva of a fungus gnat. The adults are not predaceous. The adults are not bioluminescent. It's only the larvae. And these are little bitty guys. When they're fully grown, they're not yet a half-inch long. And where you find them in North Carolina is in the mountains, on moist, like road cut banks, places like that. And where you find one, you usually find many. Grandfather Mountain has a huge population of these things. And it's really pretty spectacular because this is the bluest light of any insect-produced light in the world. And it's actually magical to see them on a road bank because they're these intense, like sapphire blue little dots that look basically like a starry sky, except it's vertical and it's sitting on a road bank. Now, they use their lights, and by the way, they have light organs at both ends, which is kind of exceptional as well. They use their lights, again, for prey capture. So they spin these webs, they have their lights on, and you see these little spicules in the webs? Those little sharp spicules are loaded with oxalic acid. So an insect flies into this, attracted to the light. It basically stabs itself on poison, and then the fly larva eats it. How cool is that?
So they're on top of the ground, not in the.
They're not in the soil. They spin their little webs on the surface of the soil. Yeah. If you ever get to go up to Grandfather to see the synchronous fireflies, you can find these right there in the same area. And I mean, I've seen a few folks, there's 2,000 synchronous fireflies over here, and they're over here watching, and they don't do anything. They just sit there, but it's still pretty magical. All right, so I just said all that without moving any of that. Isn't that wild? All right. So real quickly, I want to wrap this up by talking about firefly conservation. Fireflies, many species have been declining over the last few decades. One of the problems that fireflies have is that many of them have pretty low mobility, especially those that have larviform females. They can only disperse as far as those little females can crawl in a couple weeks. So habitat disruption, habitat fragmentation is a real important issue for them. Non-native plants may compromise some fireflies' ability to communicate. How many of y'all love microstygium? All right, microstygium is awful. It's a Japanese stilt grass. It's an awful thing, right? Yes. If you've got a dense vestiture of that on a forest floor and you've got firefly females under that trying to see males, that's probably going to interfere with their ability to communicate to some degree, right? Light pollution is a huge problem for fireflies. And you can look at the data over the last couple decades, the ambient light in most of our neighborhoods and most of the areas that we inhabit has steadily been going up at night. Fireflies rely on light for communication. If they can't see each other's lights, they don't get together, they don't mate. On top of that, many fireflies are just as confused by light as moths are. And so they actually end up hunkering down beside the porch light instead of spending their time out looking for love like they should be, right? So light pollution is a big problem. And then insecticides can have impacts on them as well, especially this practice of area spraying yards for mosquito control and things like that. That's probably not a good thing, especially during that window of time when the adults are out and flying. So you can do some important things. Bear in mind, most fireflies have life cycles of at least a year. Some may have 2-year life cycles. That habitat needs to stay stable during that entire life cycle. So if you've got wooded areas, leave the leaves, all right? As much as you can, leave the leaves in other places. A lot of these insects as larvae are associated with leaf litter. Want to make sure we maintain habitat as intact as possible. If you have any control over whether or not habitat's going to be fragmented, don't let it be fragmented. Reduce the use of insecticides around your property and limit light pollution. If you don't need that security light on, don't leave it on. If you don't need the porch light on, don't leave the porch light on. Now, I have a little other thing I do on my back porch. I keep the porch light on and I take pictures of all the moths. I call it my porch light moth project. But when I get done taking pictures for the night, I turn it off, make sure it's off, because I've seen lots of fireflies at that light. I know I'm distracting them as well. So try and limit that extraneous light. Yes, ma'am.
Does light color have any impact?
So it may. So lights that shade more towards the blue end of the spectrum tend to mess with insects more than lights that tend towards the yellow or red end of the spectrum. But, you know, a red porch light might send a bad signal, so maybe you don't want to do that. All right. Another thing that you can do to help fireflies is you can participate in some of the citizen science efforts that we have. One of these is the Firefly Atlas. This is a project from the Xerces Society. You can Google it and explore it as you will. The Xerces Society is particularly interested in a number of species that are declining, and in fact, a couple of these have already been listed as endangered species, federally endangered species. Some of these may occur in North Carolina, and we don't know it yet. So, for instance, one of the areas in this state where we have a very poor understanding of who's there is along the coast, the immediate coast. And some fireflies are associated with salt marshes, freshwater marshes that we find along the coast. So that's something that we need help with. And if you're in those areas and so predisposed, data would be very, very useful. So there's all that you can investigate yourself online. We also have in North Carolina, the Beetles of North Carolina website. This is part of the Natural Heritage Program, State Park program. And we do have some pages on fireflies. They need to be populated. I have to admit, I'm supposed to be doing that, but I haven't been doing a whole lot of it because of all my other stuff I have to do. Good news for this project is in a month and a half, I am half retired. So I'm going to spend a lot more time doing this. But this is another place where your data could be very useful to us. And again, you can investigate that at your leisure. Watching fireflies, very good hobby, very easy. Nothing much to it except to go out and look. What you might need is something to sit in, make yourself comfortable. You might need a stopwatch if you want to time the intervals between flashes to help identify species. If you want to catch them for photography, a soft net like the one you saw in that picture of me way long time ago would be useful. You might want a pleasant and refreshing beverage. That's not ever a bad idea. And if you need a light, use a red light or a blue light. All right, try not to use a white light. And that's mostly for your benefit because white light's going to disturb your night vision. It's going to make things harder to see. Now, most insects cannot see red. Most insects can't see red. And do I have time for a real short story? I did some work on Venus flytraps with a really good student a while back. And one of the things that we did was try and sort out who pollinated Venus flytraps. We got all kinds of great data in the daytime, but these pretty white flowers are out all night. Does anybody come to it at night? So we put some time-lapse cameras on our Venus flytrap flowers, came back the next morning to check them. Fireflies all over the flowers. We put a little red headlamp on a tripod so that the camera could see something. And there were fireflies all over the flytrap flowers. And we're like, National Geographic, here we come. Charismatic insect, charismatic plant. How could it be better? So we went out the next night to try and catch some fireflies so we could actually look for pollen on them. And we went out into the savannah with our little red headlights on, mosquitoes just eating us alive, and the fireflies flew at our headlights. They can see red. But a red headlamp keeps you from messing up your night vision. All right, and you might want to carry a little light because you can actually talk to fireflies if you so choose. And I've done it myself. It's actually kind of cool. I have a little video, but I'm also out of time, so I probably won't show it to you. So with that, does anybody have any questions?
I'll share these two that came in online. You spoke to this a little bit, but the synchronicity of the fireflies. Like, how are they receiving light signals? Is that through their eyes, their antenna?
Their eyes. Yeah. So you might have noticed when I showed you the pictures of the Faustus fireflies, their heads are basically all eye, because seeing a female is the only thing that's important to them in their entire life. And so it's a pure visual cue. Yeah. And how they synchronize, we're not for sure. Why they synchronize is not completely understood either. We think in the case of the mountain fireflies, they synchronize because otherwise it'd just be bedlam. Nobody would know who was doing what signal at any particular time. So they synchronize so everybody has a chance to look for females and females have a chance to look up. Yes, ma'am.
I'll bring the microphone over to folks in the room.
Okay.
While I do that, are there native plants that we can plant in our yards to attract fireflies?
So plants really, apart from being structure for them to navigate through, plants really don't mean a whole lot to fireflies. They're predaceous as larvae. The adults don't feed. And so as in all things, it's probably better to have native vegetation as much as possible on your landscape, but I don't know that there's anything you can plant that's actually going to enhance firefly populations.
Around Asheville, what likely happened to firefly larvae during the floods? And if they were adversely affected, which I kind of infer they might have been, will they return from unflooded areas?
That's a question we've been asking ourselves. Those species that have larviform females in bottomland habitats, if that habitat got scoured, they're gone. And it will probably be decades before they actually recover that. Now, the synchronous fireflies, females can fly. And so if there was some degradation of populations of synchronous fireflies, they're probably going to recover that space as the habitat returns to acceptable much more rapidly. But if there was a population of ghosts in a bottom and it got scoured, they're probably gone for the foreseeable future. But we don't know that. In fact, one of my colleagues and I have been thinking about how we might try and get a grip on that. But the problem with studying fireflies is that most of the adults only live for a couple of weeks. The peak periods only span a couple of weeks, and you can only do so much in a couple of weeks. And especially if you're teaching 240 kids about the wonders of entomology, that can impinge on your ability to do that. But we're concerned about that. Now, any of those that are in more upland areas where the soil wasn't scoured, they're probably fine.
Sort of the inverse of the previous question about plants to plant for fireflies. Just by coincidence, an article came out a week or two ago about firefly petunias. These are bioluminescent petunias that are going to be distributed in some 200 retailers across the U.S. So are there plants that we should have pause about adding to our gardens and the potential interaction with fireflies?
I have no idea what that's going to do. Part of it's going to be determined by what color they fluoresce, because different fireflies respond to different colors. But apart from that, again, I'd say, native vegetation is better than non-native. That's just wacky. I'm actually kind of inclined to get some and see what happens, just to see if they do have an impact.
One other quick question. So I spent several summers at Mammoth Cave, and there's a firefly that flashes 3 times. It goes like a half-second interval, flash, 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 and it drifts down. Does that ring a bell?
So out of that 170 species of fireflies that we know about in North America, the vast majority of them are eastern, because most fireflies prefer moist habitats. That being said, the West has, in pockets, some really weird and wacky fireflies. I've not been there. I'm not quite sure which one that might be.
It was Kentucky.
Kentucky, yeah. So 3 flashes going down. It's probably one of the Photinus, but I don't know which one. Yeah.
Just evidence that experts don't know everything. So
I'm not really an expert. I just play one on TV. So
you've proven yourself as an expert here today. We've got to wrap up the live stream of this, but I think, Clyde, if you have a few minutes to stick around, folks can come up here in the room for questions. Thank you all once again so much for attending today.